The evening was full of fake smiles and rehearsed conversations. The company party had that air of elegant pretension, where everyone wore their best clothes and hid their true intentions behind glasses of champagne and firm handshakes. I never liked this kind of event, but I was there for her. I watched as she made her way around the room, always attentive, always charming. It was impossible not to notice how all eyes were on her, but there was something different that night. A sparkle in her eyes that I hadn't seen for a while, a smile that seemed more rehearsed than genuine. Then he appeared. The boss. Elegant, confident, with that presence that effortlessly dominates the room. The way he approached her, leaning in slightly to whisper something in her ear, was like a needle sticking straight through my chest. They laughed together, and she lightly touched his arm, a small gesture, but one that carried an intimacy that shouldn't have existed. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself I was imagining things. She always had an expansive, warm way about her, but when I saw them disappearing together through the side door of the hall, I couldn't keep my unease quiet any longer. I waited a few minutes, trying to keep calm, trying to find a rational excuse. Maybe it was something to do with work, I thought. But the logic fell apart when I followed them. In the parking lot, hidden among the cars, I saw them standing next to his. The light from the lamppost above made their every move clear as day. He put a hand on her shoulder, leaning in again to say something, and she didn't flinch. On the contrary, she smiled, that smile that was once mine, and got into the car. A whirlwind of thoughts overwhelmed me. My hands were shaking as I reached for my cell phone, trying to decide whether to call them, confront them right there or simply follow the car. I chose the latter option, my heart beating like a drum as I drove a few meters behind them. His car stopped in front of a discreet hotel, far from the center, a place that seemed hand-picked for meetings that no one should know about. They got out, laughing, in no hurry, as if nothing could interrupt that moment. I took out my cell phone again, and this time I took a picture. The discreet flash was enough to capture the scene that would be burned into my memory, the two of them entering the lobby, their faces full of complicity. I waited in the car for an eternity, trying to decide what to do. The pain was suffocating, but along with it came a wave of determination that gave me strength. I called someone in her family, sent the photos and explained what I had just witnessed. The reaction on the other end was a mixture of shock and disbelief, but it didn't matter anymore. I knew that the truth needed to be exposed. Later, when she returned home, I tried to act normally. The different perfume, the slightly messy hair and the casual tone in her voice were insulting. She walked through the door as if nothing had happened, but everything had changed. I was calm, frighteningly calm, as I waited for the right moment. Dinner unfolded in a heavy silence, until I broke the tension with a simple sentence: "Where were you after the party?" The shock on her face was all I needed to confirm what I already knew. She tried to disguise it, to create lame excuses, but the evidence was against her. I took my cell phone out of my pocket and showed her the photos. "What about that?" I asked. Her expression changed to despair, tears began to flow, but I could no longer feel anything but emptiness. "You don't understand," she began, her voice shaking, but I didn't want to hear it. Her every word felt like a desperate attempt to save something she herself had destroyed. It wasn't just about the physical betrayal, it was about the breach of trust, about the fact that she had chosen someone else at that moment, even knowing what we had built together. Her betrayal was not only an affront to our relationship, but also a shadow that now hung over everything we were. What would I do with the anger, the humiliation, the photos that were now more than proof? They were memories that would never disappear. It wasn't just the pain that moved me, but the desire to understand how someone I loved so much could look me in the eye and blatantly lie. How could she have had the nerve to underestimate me so much? I didn't know exactly what would happen next. But one thing was certain, there would be no more lies. And when the news reached her family, the reaction was explosive, changing the course of that night in ways that neither she nor I could have predicted. As much as I wanted answers, what happened next was something I could never have imagined. Welcome to our channel. Here, we never support or tolerate any kind of betrayal. The stories you'll hear are fictional, created to show how infidelity can devastate lives, destroy trust and leave deep scars. Get ready for an intense narrative, full of twists and turns and emotions, that will grip you from start to finish. Take a deep breath and be ready. The story you're going to hear today is shocking and unforgettable. The hall was impeccably decorated, the soft lights reflecting off the crystal chandeliers, creating a warm glow. It was the annual party of the company where Ethan had worked for almost a decade. A methodical and dedicated man, he had always believed that building a solid career was the best way to ensure security for his family. Next to him was Sophia, his wife, a woman of subtle beauty and a captivating smile. They were a couple admired by many, the image of stability and success. However, as in so many stories, appearance didn't always reflect reality. Ethan and Sophia had been married for 11 years, a marriage that began with passionate promises and shared dreams. They met in a coffee shop in the city center, an encounter that seemed straight out of a romantic movie. He, with his calm demeanor and attentive gaze, was soon charmed by the contagious energy of Sophia, who at the time was working as an assistant in a small publishing house. The connection was instantaneous, and a few months later they were planning a future together. Over the years, the couple's life took predictable but no less challenging turns. Ethan dedicated himself to his career, gradually climbing the corporate ladder and ensuring a comfortable standard of living for both of them. Sophia, on the other hand, left the publishing house for a job at an advertising agency, where her charisma and creativity quickly made her stand out. Their days were full of work, social engagements and plans for the future, but gradually something seemed to slip away. Routine, once a symbol of security, began to become a burden. Ethan spent long hours in the office, often bringing work home. Although he believed he was doing what was best for his family, the silent nights with Sophia began to create an invisible chasm between them. She, who had always been communicative and full of life, seemed more introspective, her energy channeled into work events and deadlines. "You work too much, Ethan," Sophia remarked one evening as she collected the dinner dishes. Her tone was calm, but there was a trace of frustration. He looked at her, feeling the familiar pang of guilt. "I do it for us," he replied, more defensively than he had intended. The conversation ended like so many others, with no resolution, just an uncomfortable silence. Despite these tensions, Ethan still saw in Sophia the woman he had fallen in love with. In fleeting moments, like when she laughed at something trivial or put on some old music while she cooked, he was reminded of why he loved her. But these moments became rarer and rarer, buried under layers of responsibilities and expectations. At work, Sophia began to excel in important projects, receiving frequent praise from colleagues and superiors. One of those superiors was Damien, the agency's new creative director. Young, confident and always ready with a joke or an insightful comment, he had a magnetic presence that attracted everyone's attention. Sophia was no exception. Initially, she saw him only as a demanding but fair boss, someone who challenged her creativity and encouraged her to think outside the box. Over time, however, the casual conversations in the corridor became more frequent, the compliments more personal. "You really have a unique talent, Sophia," said Damien, during a late-night meeting. "I don't see that in many people." The compliment was direct but sincere. She smiled, surprised by the intensity of his words. "Thank you," she replied, looking away for a moment. It was rare for someone to recognize her abilities so genuinely, and it touched her more than she'd like to admit. Meanwhile, Ethan was facing his own pressures at work. The department he worked in was undergoing a restructuring, and he felt the weight of expectations becoming more and more overwhelming. Still, he carried on, motivated by the idea that his dedication was the key to protecting what was most important to him. On nights when he came home late, he found Sophia already asleep or engrossed in her cell phone. He noticed the changes, but couldn't find the right words or moment to address them. Part of him was afraid to face what it meant, so he chose to ignore it. The weeks passed, and the company party, an event that was always eagerly awaited, was approaching. Sophia, who usually didn't like these occasions, was surprisingly receptive to the idea of accompanying him. "It'll be nice to get out for a while," she said, while choosing a dress for the evening. Ethan was relieved. Perhaps this would be an opportunity to reconnect with her, away from the daily pressures. On the night of the party, they arrived together, greeting familiar faces. Ethan stayed by Sophia's side, introducing her to colleagues and superiors. However, he noticed that she looked uncomfortable, her gaze frequently wandering around the room. "Is everything okay?" he asked, leaning in to speak into her ear. "Yes, just tired," she replied, with a brief smile. As the evening progressed, Sophia wandered off to get a drink and, without Ethan realizing it, ran into Damien. He was standing near the bar, in animated conversation with other colleagues. "Sophia," he exclaimed when he saw her. "I didn't think you'd come." She smiled, feeling strangely flattered. "And missed the chance to see everyone in suits and ties?" "Never," she joked, trying to keep her tone light. Across the hall, Ethan was chatting to a work colleague, but his eyes often sought out Sophia. He saw her laughing with Damien and felt a discomfort he couldn't explain. It wasn't jealousy, exactly, but an unease that began to grow. He approached, but before he could reach them, he was intercepted by another colleague who wanted to introduce him to someone important. The party continued, with loud music and a celebratory atmosphere. Sophia seemed livelier, and Ethan tried to convince himself that this was a good thing. But there was something in the way she smiled, in the lightness of her gestures, that made him feel like a stranger in that scene. He knew that something had changed, but he still couldn't understand what. As they drove home that night, the silence in the car was almost deafening. Ethan drove, his thoughts a jumble of doubts and insecurities. Sophia stared out of the window, looking distant. He wanted to ask her what was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. And so another night ended with questions not asked and answers never given. What Ethan didn't yet know was that that night would mark the beginning of a series of events that would change everything. The days following the company party brought a strange change to Ethan and Sophia's routine. He immersed himself even more in work, as if the constant pressure and overtime were a kind of refuge. She, on the other hand, seemed more reserved, but at the same time, a different energy hung over her gestures and words. There was something about her that intrigued him and made him uneasy, a lighter, almost animated tone of voice, contrasting with the detachment that had marked their interactions for months. Ethan tried to ignore the signs, telling himself that it was just tiredness or responsibilities weighing them both down. But instinct, that silent warning that whispers when something is wrong, became harder to ignore. He began to pay more attention to details. The messages on her cell phone, which he had never noticed before, now seemed to take up a lot of her time. The smiles she gave while reading something seemed disconnected from the moment. And, above all, there were the unpredictable schedules, the work events, that came up without warning. "Are you going to be late again today?" he asked, one morning when she was already up earlier than usual, getting ready to leave. "Yes, an important meeting. I don't know exactly what time I'll be back." Her reply was accompanied by a quick but evasive smile, and Ethan noticed how she avoided his gaze as she adjusted her earrings in the mirror. He knew that insisting on the conversation at that moment would lead nowhere. But doubt grew like a shadow, and he began to pay attention to things that had previously gone unnoticed. The smiles she saved for messages instead of conversations with him. The stronger perfume she wore to work. The nights when she said she was exhausted, but stayed up longer than necessary typing on her cell phone. One night, when Sophia said she was having another business dinner, Ethan felt the weight of silence take over the house. He sat on the sofa for hours, wondering how things had gotten to this point. It wasn't irrational jealousy or paranoia. It was the growing void between them, the space he no longer knew how to fill. Something was changing, and he needed to understand what it was. That's why, that night, he made a decision. He decided to find out what was really going on. It wasn't something Ethan imagined doing one day. The idea of invading Sophia's privacy made him uncomfortable. But he could no longer bear the doubts eating away at his mind. When she left the house, he waited for a few minutes before grabbing his car keys and heading in the same direction. He kept enough distance so as not to be noticed, his heart pounding with every turn. The city was lit up, but Ethan barely noticed the lights around him. All that mattered was her car, always in sight, always around the next corner. When she parked in front of a fancy restaurant, he stopped a few meters behind, not sure what he was expecting to find. Inside the restaurant, he saw her sitting at a table by the window, and the sight made his stomach turn. She was with Damien. They were laughing, gesticulating, and the closeness between them was impossible to ignore. Ethan tried to convince himself that this was just work, a meeting between colleagues. But the looks they exchanged and the way she leaned her body towards him said something else. Ethan stood outside, watching, feeling like a spectator of his own life. He didn't know how long it was until he saw the two of them get up, still smiling, and leave together. Sophia and Damien walked to his car, talking quietly. He opened the door for her to get in, and the gentlemanly gesture that had once been so familiar to Ethan now felt like a direct blow to his heart. Without thinking, he began to follow them again, keeping a safe distance. The drive was long, and every kilometer seemed to stretch out time, making him more anxious. When the car stopped in front of an inconspicuous hotel, Ethan parked across the street. He watched as Damien got out first and went to Sophia's side, opening the door for her. She got out with a smile that Ethan knew well, but which now seemed like a thunderclap in his mind. They entered the hotel without hesitation. The reality of the moment hit him like an avalanche. The woman he loved, who he had sworn to protect and with whom he had built a life, now seemed as distant as a stranger. Ethan remained in the car, his mind struggling to process what was happening. It was as if a part of him wanted to believe that there was a logical explanation, but the scene before his eyes left little room for doubt. The pain was suffocating, but there was something else growing inside him, a grim determination. He needed proof, not just to confront Sophia, but to have something tangible to confirm what he feared. Taking out his cell phone, he snapped a photo of the hotel, the name in neon glowing in the night like a silent accusation. He waited, time passing slowly, until the two of them left again. The dawn was cold, and the silence seemed to amplify every detail of the moment. When Damien and Sophia finally left the hotel, their hands touched briefly before they said goodbye. Ethan captured one more image, each click of his cell phone a mixture of pain and perverse relief. When he returned home that night, everything seemed different. The house that had once been a refuge now seemed heavy, full of memories that he no longer knew whether they were real or built on lies. He sat in the living room, staring into the emptiness, trying to decide what he would do next. The images on his cell phone were a cruel truth, but he knew that this was only the beginning. Sophia arrived home shortly afterwards, wearing the same calm expression she always wore. "How was your evening?" she asked, with a casualness that almost made Ethan laugh with bitterness. "Quiet," he replied, without taking his eyes off the floor. The silence between them that night was thicker than ever. Ethan knew he couldn't confront her yet. He needed to wait for the right moment, when he could not only ask the questions, but also demand the answers he deserved. And when the truth finally came out, he knew it would change everything. The silence at dinner seemed deafening. Ethan sat at the table, fingers crossed, while Sophia watched him with an expression that mixed discomfort and curiosity. He had asked them to talk, his voice firm but carrying a tone she hadn't heard in years. Something was different about him, and it bothered her more than she wanted to admit. "So, Ethan, what was so important that it couldn't wait until tomorrow?" Sophia broke the silence, trying to sound casual, but there was a nervousness in her tone that she couldn't hide. He raised his eyes slowly, letting the weight of his gaze hit her. "Sophia, I'm trying to understand something. Something that's been keeping me awake." His voice was controlled, but she could feel the underlying tension in every word. "What do you mean?" she asked, adjusting herself in the chair. His smile was forced, an attempt to normalize the conversation. But her heart began to race, anticipating something she couldn't identify. Ethan pulled his cell phone out of his pocket and placed it on the table. He didn't open the photos immediately, but the gesture made her swallow. "I've been feeling something's wrong for weeks," he began. "You know, I've always trusted you. I've never questioned your schedule, your choices. But now, I wonder if I've been too naive." Sophia frowned, trying to keep her composure. "Ethan, what are you talking about? Are you accusing me of something?" He sighed deeply, as if gathering the strength to continue. "I followed you that night at the company party," he said, finally. Every word seemed to hang heavy in the air. "I saw you with Damien." The name was like a sharp blade. She blinked a few times, trying to process what she had just heard. "Damien? Ethan, he's my boss. We had an informal meeting." "That's not unusual." "A meeting in a hotel?" The question was asked with frightening calm, but the pain in his eyes was evident. Sophia froze, her mind racing to find a justification, anything that could dispel what was brewing between them. "You don't understand. I needed to discuss something important, and the restaurant was full, so you decided that a hotel room was the most appropriate place." Ethan interrupted, his voice rising for the first time. He pulled out his cell phone again and opened the photos. The images spoke for themselves, she and Damien entering the hotel together, laughing, complicit. "Is this what you call work?" She looked at the photos, her face pale. "Ethan, it's not what it looks like." But even she knew that those words sounded empty, cliched. He didn't reply, letting silence fill the space between them. Sophia closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She knew that lying wouldn't do any more. "Ethan, I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. But it doesn't mean anything. I love you, you have to believe that. Do you love me?" He laughed, but there was no humor in his voice, only incredulity. "Love, Sophia, is based on respect, on trust. And you've destroyed that." She began to cry, her shoulders shaking. "Please, Ethan, let me explain." It was a moment of weakness. "I felt alone. You were so distant. He stood up abruptly, his chair creaking. "Do you think what I did was easy? Spending nights and weekends working, all to give you a comfortable life, so that you never lacked for anything? It wasn't about money, Ethan," she shouted, finally losing control. "It was about us. I felt like I wasn't important to you, like I was disappearing. So the solution was to look for someone else. To cheat on someone who had dedicated years to building a life with you." He looked at her with a mixture of anger and pain. "You didn't even try to tell me how you felt. You didn't try to save what we had." She sobbed, hiding her face in her hands. "I knew it was wrong. I knew it. But, it was just once. I promise. I'm finished. There's nothing between us now." Ethan stood still, his eyes fixed on her. He didn't know what hurt more, the betrayal itself or the fact that, even in the face of everything, part of him still wanted to believe her. He sat down again, running his hands over his face, exhausted. "There's something you're not telling me, isn't there?" He spoke suddenly, his voice lower but laden with determination. "Sophia, look at me. If you want any chance of fixing this, be honest with me." She hesitated, the tears stopping for a moment. "Ethan, I've already told you everything." "No, you haven't." He leaned forward, looking directly into her eyes. "I know you well enough to know that there's something more. And if I find out from someone else, it'll be the end for good." Sophia took a deep breath, as if she was about to jump off a cliff. Guilt, shame and fear mixed in her chest. But she said nothing more, and Ethan knew that the truth was still hidden, waiting to be revealed. The silence returned to the room, thick and suffocating. Sophia was faced with a choice that would change everything, but for now she just looked at Ethan, trying to find a way out of what seemed inevitable. And he, for his part, knew that the truth would come out, but he had no idea how much there was still to discover. Ethan got up from the table and walked over to the window, his gaze lost in the darkness outside. The house was plunged into a heavy silence, interrupted only by Sophia's low sobs. He crossed his arms, trying to maintain the calm that seemed to seep through his fingers. "I still can't understand how it came to this, Sophia," he began, his voice almost a whisper. "We were something solid. Something I believed to be unshakable." She watched him from the table, her trembling hands clenching her napkin as if it could stop her mind from completely falling apart. "Ethan, I know I made an unforgivable mistake, but I'm here, willing to do whatever it takes to make it right. Just tell me what you need." He slowly turned to face her. "I need the truth." There was a firmness in his voice that left no room for doubt. "If there's something else, something you haven't told me yet, now is the time. Not later, not when it's too late." She hesitated, and that brief moment of uncertainty seemed to last an eternity. Sophia knew she was facing an abyss, but she also knew that there was no other way but to face it. "Damien, she paused, searching for words that could soften the impact, but none seemed sufficient. "He made me feel like I mattered again." Ethan's reaction was immediate. He laughed bitterly, but not in humor, but in disbelief. "Important? So, while I was spending sleepless nights wondering how to keep our life stable, you were seeking validation in the arms of another man? It's not that simple." Sophia stood up, now with a firmer tone. "Do you think all this happened out of the blue? That it was a calculated decision? I felt invisible, Ethan, invisible in our own home." He took a step towards her, his eyes fixed on hers. "Do you think I didn't realize how far apart we were drifting? Do you think I didn't feel the same loneliness? The difference is that I tried, Sophia. I tried to hold on to everything, even when it seemed impossible." She looked away, her tears silently flowing again. "I know," she whispered. "And that's why I'm here, trying to save what we still have." Ethan shook his head, exhaustion evident in his movements. "Save what? I don't even know what there is to save anymore." Silence enveloped them again, but this time it was broken by the sound of Sophia's cell phone vibrating on the table. She looked at the device and saw Damien's name on the screen. Her face paled, and she tried to ignore it, but Ethan had already seen. "Is he still calling you?" The question was asked in a cold tone, but the fire behind the words was unmistakable. Sophia quickly picked up her cell phone, pressing the mute button. "I'm not going to answer it. I'm done with him, Ethan." "That's what you say," he replied, crossing his arms. "But how can I believe you? How can I trust someone who has lied to me for so long?" She took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. "Because I'm here, facing you, willing to face all this, to face the consequences. If I wanted to keep lying, I wouldn't have come to you. I would have hidden everything." Ethan took a step back, as if he needed distance to process everything. He knew she was partly right, but that didn't make it any easier. The phone vibrating again was like a cruel reminder of the reality he was now facing. "I'm going to ask you one more time, Sophia," he said, with a calm that seemed forced. "Is there something else you're not telling me?" She looked at him, her eyes red and tired. "No. I've already told you everything." He was silent for a moment, studying every detail of her expression. "All right," he finally said, his voice low. "Then I guess that's it. I need time to think. I don't know how to go from here." Sophia took a step towards him, but he held up his hand, asking her to stop. "Please, not now." She nodded slowly, realizing that she had overstepped every possible boundary. Ethan grabbed his coat and car keys and left without saying another word. The sound of the door closing behind him was like the final echo of a night that seemed to have no end. Sophia stood in the middle of the living room, cell phone still in hand, until it vibrated again. She looked at the screen, Damien's name flashing once again. This time, she answered, her voice filled with anger and despair. "Stop calling me. You've done enough damage." "I needed to talk to you," Damien replied, his voice deep on the other end of the line. "We didn't finish this properly." "Yes, we did," she said firmly. "And now I'm trying to save my marriage, so please leave me alone." "If you really thought you could save something, you wouldn't be taking my call," he retorted, with a confidence that only irritated her more. She hung up without answering, throwing her cell phone on the sofa. Feeling emotionally exhausted, Sophia collapsed in the armchair, staring into the void, tears still falling. What she didn't know was that, outside, Ethan had parked his car a few meters from the house, unable to go very far. He wanted distance, but he couldn't completely sever the bond. Something inside him pulled him back, even if everything seemed lost. The engine switched off, he leaned back in the seat, lost in thought. Sophia's image, her crying, her words, everything seemed to blend together in a jumble of feelings that he didn't know how to sort out. He knew that the truth could bring clarity, but the cost of that truth was too high. And, deep down, he still felt that there was something more, one last missing piece to complete the puzzle. The night was colder than Ethan had realized. Sitting in the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel, he didn't feel time passing. The distant rumble of other cars' tires echoed in the distance, but in his mind, everything was focused on Sophia. Her words still rang out, mixed in with his own questions. He had left the house to find clarity, but all he felt was a growing emptiness. He finally decided to return home. Not because he had found an answer, but because he knew that prolonged absence would bring no solutions. When he entered, the silence was almost palpable. The lights were off, except for the lamp in the living room. Sophia was sitting on the sofa, curled up, as if the weight of the previous conversation was still holding her there. She looked up when she heard him come in, but didn't say anything. Ethan dropped his keys on the table and stood still for a moment, watching her. There was something in the way she was sitting, something more than sadness, it looked like she was preparing for something bigger. "I couldn't go far," he said, his voice low and husky. "I couldn't leave it at that." Sophia straightened up on the sofa, taking a deep breath before replying. "Ethan, I don't know what to say to make it less painful." "Maybe because there's nothing that can be said," he replied, approaching her slowly and sitting down in the opposite armchair. "But you were right about one thing, whatever happened between us, it didn't happen suddenly. It's just that doesn't make it any easier." She nodded, her eyes fixed on the floor. The silence that followed felt like a minefield, every word that could be said posing a risk of everything exploding. Ethan finally decided to break the silence. "You said there was nothing more." "That everything has been said," he began. "But something still doesn't make sense, Sophia. I know you. I know when something is being hidden." She sighed, the weight of his words pressing down on her shoulders. "Ethan, the words caught in her throat. She knew she needed to be honest, but the fear of the consequences paralyzed her. "Please, Sophia," he insisted. "If there's anything left between us that's worth saving, it has to start with the truth." She stood up and walked over to the window, where she remained silent for a moment. Finally, she turned to him, her eyes full of tears. "Damien, he wasn't just my boss, Ethan. He was more than that." Ethan frowned, trying to understand. "What do you mean?" Sophia closed her eyes, tears welling up. He knew things about me. Things that I never wanted you to know." "Things like what, Sophia?" He stood up, the tension in his voice growing. "What did he know that you couldn't tell me?" She hesitated, but knew there was no turning back. I knew him before. Before us. He and I, we had a relationship. And when he showed up at the agency, everything came back. The memories, the mistakes. Ethan stood still, as if he'd been hit. Did you know that all this time? That he was someone from your past? And you didn't tell me? I was afraid, she admitted, her arms crossed as if trying to protect herself. Afraid that it would change the way you see me. Afraid that you wouldn't be able to handle it. Are you kidding me? He shook his head in disbelief. You were worried about what I would think, but not about the fact that you were working with someone you had a past with? I thought I could keep that separate, she said, her voice almost inaudible. But then things started to get out of hand. Ethan felt as if the ground had disappeared from under his feet. Sophia's betrayal was painful enough, but knowing that there was a history, a previous connection that she had never mentioned, made it all the more difficult to process. You lied to me from the beginning, he finally said, his voice shaking. It wasn't just the betrayal, Sophia. It was the fact that you built a castle of secrets and expected me to live inside it without question. She took a step towards him, but he stepped back. Ethan, please. I'm not trying to justify what I did. I know I was wrong. But I never stopped loving you. Love? He laughed, a bitter laugh that filled the room. What do you mean by love, Sophia? Because, for me, love is honesty. It's partnership. That's not what we had. She lowered her head, defeated. I know it may be too late, but I'm willing to do anything to make it right. Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain that seemed infinite. I don't know if it can be fixed, Sophia. You don't understand what you've destroyed. He picked up the keys again and walked towards the door. I need time. I need to think. And this time, I don't know when, or if, I'll be back. The door closed behind him, leaving Sophia alone in the silence of the house. She fell to her knees, tears rolling down, feeling lost in the weight of her own choices. And as she cried, one thing became clear, even if there was a chance of reconciliation, she would never be able to erase the marks that had been left on both of them. The days following Ethan's departure were marked by a deafening silence in the house. Sophia wandered the rooms like a shadow, dealing with his absence and the echo of the words that had been spoken. Every corner of the house seemed to carry a piece of their history, now shattered. She knew she couldn't blame him for needing distance, but that didn't make the loneliness any easier to bear. Ethan, on the other hand, had stayed in a simple hotel, far from the house where everything seemed to remind him of what he had lost. He spent his days at work, trying to keep his mind occupied, but the nights were relentless. He relived the moments of discovery, the pain of the revelations, and wondered if he would ever be able to look at Sophia without feeling the betrayal like an open wound. It was during one of these evenings, as he was flipping through the photos on his cell phone, that something caught his eye. He had taken those pictures to confront her, but now they seemed to carry a different weight. In one of the photos, Damien and Sophia were close enough to look like a couple, but his gaze had something calculated, almost predatory. Ethan zoomed in, noticing for the first time the sense of control that Damien seemed to exert. He couldn't pinpoint exactly why, but it planted a seed of doubt. The next morning, still bothered, Ethan made a decision. He went to the agency where Sophia worked and asked to speak to Damien. When he arrived at the office, he was greeted by a man who seemed to have been taken aback by his visit. Ethan, right? Said Damien, with a cold smile and a tone of false cordiality. Sophia didn't mention you were coming. That's because she doesn't know, replied Ethan, sitting down without waiting for an invitation. I need to talk to you. Man to man. Damien leaned in slightly, crossing his arms, as if assessing what was to come. Of course. What can I do for you? Ethan was direct. What did you really want with Sophia? Was it just an affair, or was there something more? Damien raised his eyebrows, feigning surprise. I don't know what you're implying, but I don't think it's appropriate for us to discuss personal matters in my workplace. Spare me the formality, snapped Ethan. You knew exactly what you were doing. You manipulated the situation, and now I'm here to understand why. Damien laughed, but the nervousness in his eyes was noticeable. Manipulated? That's ridiculous. Sophia made her own decisions, just as you made yours by neglecting your marriage. The words hit Ethan, but he didn't back down. You knew about our marriage. You knew about our history. And you still chose to be part of it. What does that give you? A feeling of power? Damien lost his smile, leaning forward. Do you think it's so simple? That the world revolves around your suffering? You weren't there, Ethan. You didn't see how she felt. Ethan stood up, his fists clenched, but before he said anything he might regret, he just took a step back. You're right. I wasn't there. But now I know who you are. He left the office, leaving Damien alone with his facade apparently intact. However, Ethan's words had planted something in him too, a feeling that his superiority had been challenged. Meanwhile, Sophia, desperate for some form of redemption, began writing a letter to Ethan. She knew that words would never be enough to repair the damage, but she felt she owed him a full explanation, something that might bring clarity, if not for him, at least for herself. The letter was harder to write than she had imagined. Each line felt like a painful reminder of the choices she had made. When it was finally finished, she decided to deliver it in person. She went to the hotel where she knew Ethan was staying. He greeted her in the lobby, clearly surprised to see her there. I didn't come to argue, said Sophia, handing him the envelope. I just wanted you to read this. And if you want, we can talk later. Ethan took the envelope, hesitating for a moment before nodding. She left without saying another word, leaving him alone to stare at the pages he was holding. He returned to his room, opened the envelope and began to read. The letter wasn't an excuse. It was an honest, painful account of her failings, her insecurities and the choices she had made. She wrote about Damien, about the weight of meeting him again and about how she had let herself be carried away by a neediness that she had never had the courage to admit. But there was something more. In the last few lines, she revealed something Ethan hadn't expected. Damien had used the knowledge of their past to blackmail her emotionally. He knew she was vulnerable and used this to create a connection that, deep down, Sophia never wanted. The revelation shook Ethan to the core. Not because it excused Sophia's actions, but because it showed a layer of manipulation that he hadn't noticed before. He finished reading, feeling exhausted. Deep down, he knew that the information wouldn't erase the pain, but it would change his perspective. He needed to face not only Sophia, but also his own emotions. The next morning, he found her in a park, where they had agreed to meet. Sophia was sitting on a bench, waiting, with an expression of obvious anxiety. When Ethan approached, she immediately stood up. I've read the letter, he began, looking straight into her eyes. And I need to tell you something. You hurt me in ways I can't even describe. But what you went through with Damien, that's not fair either. She started to cry, but he continued. I don't know if we can fix this. I don't know if I want to. But what I do know is that you need to rebuild. For you. Sophia nodded, knowing there was nothing more to be said. Ethan took a step back, took a deep breath and started walking, leaving her there. It wasn't the ending she wanted, but it was the ending they needed. In the end, Ethan found a way to move on, rebuilding his life away from the shadows of the past. Sophia, for her part, began to seek help, facing the ghosts that had brought her to that point. And Damien, confronted by the agency after Ethan exposed his manipulations, saw his career crumble. Stories like these show how choices can devastate lives. If you've made it this far, leave a comment on what you thought of this story. Subscribe to the channel for more impactful narratives. Remember, we don't support any kind of betrayal here. Betrayal destroys trust, families, and lives. Until the next story.